Lovely. Thanks, Jack. Okay, there you go, Claire.
Thanks so much. Before I go any further, yeah, the normal sort of Teams etiquette, if we could apply that today, please. So when you're not speaking, if you could keep on mute so that we minimise any background noise. When I come to do sort of question and answer the session towards the end, you can raise your hand or you can put your question into the chat. And just to let you know that all of the slides that we're going to be presenting today, we will share both the slides and the recording after the session with everyone who's attended. We are going to be rattling through an awful lot of information for you, so don't worry if you miss the odd bit, because as I say, those slides will be shared. So what we're going to do is start by I'm going to give you a little bit of background on the seed sourcing grant and its scope. Then Megan, my colleague from Forestry Commission, is going to run through with you the actual process of how to apply and the eligibility criteria. And then we'll move into the sort of lessons learnt part. So I will be introducing my colleague Maddie from DEFRA, and she's been looking at some of the projects that didn't quite make it through in the previous round and where they fell down. And she's going to give you a bit of an analysis of these common pitfalls and how to overcome them. And then finally, we've invited to join us some experts in seed conservation, collecting and management, in the FRM system and in forestry genetics. I won't introduce them now, but I'll be introducing that panel to you later on. And they're basically have very kindly agreed to sort of be here to answer any questions that you might have in that technical space. So with that, I think I'll move on, if that's okay, please, Megan. So the background to the SSG, as I'm sure you're all very well aware, is that government is aiming to significantly increase tree planting rates. We have a commitment to treble tree planting rates in England by 2025, but probably of more relevance for this grant is the now legally binding targets to increase tree and woodland cover to 16.5% of total land area by 2050. Obviously, a secure and diverse supply of tree seed is absolutely fundamental if we want to create healthy, resilient woodlands, because we can't grow a diverse range of trees if we haven't got the appropriate seed to do so. So resilient woodlands, we expect to be planting that will enable us to better manage the impacts of climate change and pests and diseases in the future. But our other objective is to increase domestic production of trees in order to reduce the need to buy both seed and trees from the international market, because that obviously lowers our risks of importing harmful pests and pathogens. Next. Thank you. So we developed the seed sourcing grant as a competitive capital grant. It's delivered and administered by Forestry Commission, and it was first launched last year. We're seeking to increase not just the quantity, but also the quality and the diversity of tree seed available. And so that means we're supporting activities to increase the number and diversity of both seed stands and seed orchards that are on the Forest Reproductive Materials National Register of Basic Material. The SSG is a sister grant to the Tree Production Innovation Fund and the Tree Production Capital Grant. So across those three grants, we're aiming to support the sector in every way we can to get to that objective that I've just outlined of increasing quantity, quality and diversity of seed and trees available. And as I say, we've already done one round of seed sourcing grants, and you can look at the projects that we supported last time on .gov.uk. Thanks, Megan. So in this round, we have up to £747,000 available, and that can be spent over the coming 2 years up until March 2025. The funding is available for any species that's listed in the UK FRM scheme. Activities which are related to our 21 priority species, which I'll describe in more detail in a minute, will be funded at 100%, and other projects will be funded at 50%. I'd say the funding is available up to and including March 2025. So in other words, multi-year proposals across financial years are eligible. And you can also apply for multiple bids. So you could have multiple projects within the round. Each lead applicant can apply for a maximum of £75,000 per financial year, but that is across all of their bids. And the minimum cost of a bid is £10,000 a year to be eligible for funding. So we've identified 4 areas of activity that are eligible for funding. The first is around management of existing seed stands, and this is basically to ensure that they're as productive as possible for seed collectors. These seed stands must either be already registered or you need to bring them onto the register as part of the proposed project. And this is time-bound activities. So within the SSG, we're not able to offer ongoing financial support for management of existing stands. It's around bringing a stand into management and putting in place specific activities over a fixed time period. The second area is desk and field studies that identify and bring new seed stands onto the National Register. So this is about identifying stands that are already existing within the landscape but haven't been identified as seed stands and put on the register. The third is around planning and planting of new seed stands, and again, bringing them onto the register. And the fourth is around planning and planting of new seed orchards. And your activity can include, your application can include bringing multiple activities from this list together. The categories of FRM that the grant covers are all, so from source identified to selected, qualified and tested reproductive material. And as I've just explained, that can cover both seed stands and seed orchards. So we have developed, some of you will have already seen from the previous round, some priority species strategies. These were developed through an earlier project by technical experts, and they provide some suggested approaches to how you might go about increasing and improving the sources of seed for the priority species. We have 21 priority species in this round. 2 have been removed from round 1 because we've already now funded work on those species. So these 21 priority species are the current priority for support. We will continue to review what our priority species list is over time, but right now these are our priorities, and that is reflected in the evaluation criteria and the payment rates. But the scheme is open to proposals covering any species on the UK FRM scheme, and that includes the voluntary scheme. So again, based on what we already funded in round 1, we're particularly looking for proposals this time to identify and register seed stands of beech and Norway maple, and also to develop new seed stands or orchards for aspen, elder, common hawthorn, holly, Norway maple, white beam and wild apple. And the list of priority species is available on the .gov website, but just to briefly share it on my screen with you there. As I say, these species are under constant review, but this list is based on some very in-depth work where we looked at the current seed sources that are on the basic register. We looked at supply and demand, we worked with nurseries, and we looked at the ecology of the species in question. So I hope that helps. I know I can see some of you are putting your hands up. We are going to keep going if that's all right, just because we've got quite a lot to present to you, and I suspect we'll answer some of your questions as we go through the slide pack. So if you can just bear with us, and we obviously will definitely be answering questions at the end. But for now, I'm going to hand over to Megan from FC, who's going to run through the grant in a little more detail. Thanks, Megan.
Great, thank you, Claire. So yeah, as Claire said, I'm now going to run through the eligibility criteria for the grant and then move on to a bit more detail about how to apply and make an application. So, there we go. So first off, we have some broad criteria that your project must meet in order for you to apply. As Claire has already touched on, your project proposal can cover any of the species covered by the UK FRM scheme. If you're unsure of those, we've put them in a tab on the seed sourcing grant finance spreadsheet, so you can have a little look there. The seed stand or orchard must be in England. The work to be funded must not have started yet. You should only start carrying out work if you're successful and once you've signed an agreement with us. And activities must be associated with one of the eligible FRM categories that Claire's already covered. So what costs are eligible under the grant? This isn't an exhaustive list, but it covers most of the kind of items that we'd expect to offer funding for. So it includes things like staff and contract costs, seeds and saplings, consumables for the kind of management activities that Claire mentioned earlier, contribution towards equipment. I will note here that we're unlikely to offer funding for really expensive bits of kit, but you may want to ask for a contribution to such equipment to cover the costs of using it for this project. So just bear that in mind when you're putting together any proposals. And then also travel and subsistence for activities specifically related to the grant. Claire mentioned earlier that the list of successful projects from last year are published on gov.uk, so it's worth having a look at that to see what other people did last year. And if you haven't already, Jack, it would be good to pop the link into the chat for that. Thank you. So this next slide runs through items that are ineligible for funding. I won't read out every single item, but basically it covers any costs that fall outside of the funding period. Also insurance for capital items or staff, repair and ongoing maintenance to equipment, and then costs or overheads like rent and utilities related to staff working on the project. So yeah, please do check through this list in detail when putting together your application to make sure that all of your costs are eligible. So this slide covers who can apply for the grant. So the grant is open to any UK-based public, private or third sector organisation. Private landowners can also apply if they're applying for work on their own land. We've listed the types of applicants we would expect to apply to the grant. Again, this isn't exhaustive. So if you're not on the list, then that doesn't mean that you're not eligible. It's worth noting that we'll accept joint applications, and we like to see kind of collaborations on projects. If that's the case, you'll need to nominate someone to be the lead applicant for the project. If you're successful, they'll be the person who's on the agreement and they'll receive the funding from us. And if you are kind of making a joint application, we just ask you to list the partners on the application form and explain how you'll be working together. So that covers the background to the grant and the eligibility criteria. I'm now going to talk through how to apply. I'm going to go through step by step, so apologies if there's a lot of information. As Claire said, we're going to be sharing the slides and recording with you afterwards, so you can refer back to that when you're actually kind of putting your application together. So this just gives an overview of the process. So it's a single stage application process, and we ask you to complete an application form and a finances spreadsheet. All the forms and guidance are on the gov.uk website. I've included the link here, but I think Jack's going to pop it in the chat for you as well. Basically, when you go to this page, you should get a list of documents, like on the right-hand side. So you can find the application form and the finance spreadsheet there. There's also this guidance for applicants document. I'd really recommend you having a look at that because it has all of the detail of kind of what we're looking for on each question. So that's definitely worth having a look at. All questions on the form are mandatory. Once you've completed your form, please return it to us with your spreadsheet to the SSG email address, which is on the slide. And the deadline is 5 to midnight on Monday, the 17th of July. So you've got plenty of time to apply. If you have any questions in the meantime, you can also get in touch with us at that same email address. Okay, so part one of the application starts by asking for some personal details and background to your project. This includes, we'll ask for a list of species that you're applying for. And if you're applying to manage an existing seed stand or seed orchard, we'd want you to give us the ID of that from the Register of UK Basic Materials. There's then a list of eligibility criteria. I've given you an example at the bottom of the slide here. Please read through each of these really carefully and confirm whether you fulfill each of the criteria. When we receive your application, the first thing we'll do is check whether it's eligible, and we'll go through this list. So yeah, just pay extra attention to detail on that one and make sure you haven't missed any off. So part two of the application has 8 questions, and these are the questions that the panel will use to score your application. So please try and provide as much detail as possible in these questions whilst also sticking within the word limit. You'll notice that I've put in brackets the weighting of each of these questions. The first 2 are weighted at 20%, and the following questions are weighted at 10%. I'm going to go through each of the questions. There's more detail on the slides, though, than I'll run through. So I would really encourage you to look back at these slides at a later date and just make sure you're addressing all of the points when you're answering each of these questions. So question 1 is about the species seed strategies. So these are what Claire mentioned earlier. We're essentially looking for an explanation of how your project meets the species strategies. If you're applying for a non-priority species, we're wanting you to explain the rationale for your approach in this question. Question 2 asks what impact your project would have on sector capacity. So essentially, how will your project lead to more seed being available for tree production in England? And how will it benefit the market? Question 3 is about longevity. So we're asking here for you to explain how you'll ensure your project has benefits into the future. So how will you manage your seed stand or orchard long term so it's productive after the end of the grant? We're looking for those kind of things. Question 4 asks you to describe your team, their skills and experience, and your organisation's track record. I mentioned earlier about submitting applications with partners. We'd want you to also explain their kind of skills and experience in this question as well. And then question 5 is about deliverability. So basically, how will you manage your project effectively? On this question, if you'd like to include a Gantt chart or a similar project plan to support your response to the question, you're very welcome to. Just submit that as an extra document with your application and refer to it in the questions so the panel know to look for it. Question 6 asks about the risks of your project and how you'd mitigate these. Again, if you'd like to include a separate risks log, please send that in with your application and mention it in the question. The next question is about additionality. So this essentially means what difference will public funding make to your project? So perhaps the project would only go ahead with public funding, or the funding would allow you to do it on a larger scale. And then lastly, question 8 is about costs and value for money. Here we want you to justify the costs of your project and why it represents good value for money. If you're applying for a non-priority species, we'll also want you to explain where your match funding comes from. And the evaluation panel will also use your finances spreadsheet when reviewing your response to this question, and I'll come on to that shortly. So those 8 questions will be scored individually by our panel. And as I mentioned, the first 2 are double weighted at 20% and the rest are at 10%. The panel will score each question out of 4. So 0 is unacceptable and 4 is excellent. Any application that scores 0 for any question will be rejected. So make sure that you do submit a kind of decent response to every question, and proposals must score a minimum of 20 out of 40 to be eligible. So I've already mentioned that you need to submit a finances spreadsheet with your application form. So this is basically a detailed breakdown of the costs of your project and in which financial year you'll be making those. I've included a few tips on here for when you're filling out your finances spreadsheet. So firstly, we'd advise you to think really carefully about the financial year in which you're applying for funding. You can apply for funds in this financial year and next financial year. Any activities you apply for in a particular financial year will need to be complete and invoiced by 27th of March of that year. Also, we can't move money between financial years. So if you underspend in your first year, you can't carry that money forward into the next. So just consider what you can realistically complete within the time frame. Secondly, we'd encourage you to seek quotes before applying, so you're confident in the costs that you're requesting. If your numbers look suspiciously round or unrealistic, the panel may query those. And then lastly, if you're successful, you'll only be able to claim back irrecoverable VAT on your costs. So what this means basically is if you would be able to recover VAT on your costs, when you're putting together your finance spreadsheet, please quote costs exclusive of VAT. If you wouldn't be able to recover VAT on your costs, please quote costs inclusive of VAT. I know people can have very strange VAT setup. So if you've got any questions about that, then please do get in touch and we can discuss with you. So this is just to show what the finance spreadsheet looks like. It's pretty self-explanatory, I hope. As you can see, you'll need to itemize your spending, and we would encourage you to be as specific as you can on that. The final column should automatically calculate the percentage contribution that you're applying for. We'd obviously expect that to only be up to 50% if you're applying for a non-priority species. To the right of the main table, there's this little grey box, and that just summarises the total costs that you're applying for. Please double check that before you submit and make sure it is showing what you expect it to show. If you're successful, this will basically form the budget for your agreement, so it's really important that it's right. So going back to the main form, part 4 of the application form asks you to outline your proposed activities, outputs and outcomes. This basically forms the basis of your agreement with us if you're successful. The funded activities are essentially what will you be doing in each financial year. For the outputs, we want to know what will result from those activities. We'd encourage you to quantify this if possible. So it could be the number of trees that you'll have planted or the area of a seed stand that will have been brought into management. So yeah, if you can quantify that wherever possible, that would be great. And then finally, for the outcomes, we want to understand what you expect to happen longer term beyond the period of the grant. And again, if you can quantify that, that would be brilliant. We understand that on this last one, it's a bit of a guessing game, but if you can just give us your kind of best estimate, that would be really helpful. So the final sections of the form are largely there for your information, so please do read through those. In part 8, there's a list of 10 declarations, and you'll need to read each of those, and if you agree to them, tick the box next to it. Again, that's something that we'll look at when you submit your application, so please make sure you haven't missed any. And then finally, in part 10, you'll need to sign your form. Just a few specifics on what we accept here. You'll need to add a digital e-signature, so you could do that through Adobe or another PDF program. If you can't do that, you'll need to print it off, sign it and scan it back in. We can't accept just a typed in signature. Also, please make sure that the person named at the beginning of the form matches the person signing the form. And then lastly, just a note to say that if there's anything commercially sensitive in your application, please let us know and we can mark it as such. Okay, so this just covers the next steps once you've submitted your application. So the deadline is the 17th of July at 5 to midnight. The panel will then be meeting to review applications at the end of July. We then hope to issue outcome letters and grant agreements in mid-August. And then if you're successful, as soon as you have an agreement and you've signed that and returned it to us, you can start any 2023-24 work. Please don't start any work before then because you won't be eligible to claim that back. Just another quick note that occasionally getting agreements out can be delayed. Sometimes the panel will come back with questions or clarifications. So when you're planning your project, make sure you've got a little bit of contingency if the start of your project is delayed. So this is my last slide, so thank you for bearing with me. I just wanted to briefly explain what will happen with payments and reporting if you were to be successful under the grant. So we'll ask for a final report at the end of the project. And for 2-year projects, we'll also ask for a progress report at the end of the financial year as well. In each financial year, you'll be able to claim at the end of the year and on one other date of your choosing. And when you claim, we'll ask for you to submit evidence of all of your expenditure. So as you're going along, we'd encourage you to keep copies of all invoices and receipts and keep a record of staff time. Once you've submitted a completed claim and we've approved that, we'll make payment by BACS transfer. So all payments will be made in arrears. And then just to reiterate that any reports and claims in 2023-24 will need to be submitted by the 27th of March 2024. Lovely. So that's the end of my section. I know that's a lot of information, but as I said, I'd encourage you to refer back to the guidance documents and the slides. I'm now going to hand over to Maddie, who's going to run through some of the lessons learned from last year's applications.
Thanks, Megan. Okay, hi everyone. I'm Maddie from DEFRA, and I'm going to do quite a short lessons learned session reflecting on the first round of the SSG. So as Claire said, I've been looking back through last year's applications and the panel's feedback to bring together some of the common downfalls from the applications, as we had a few proposals last year that were strong and the panel really liked the vision, but they just had a few things holding them back and just didn't score quite highly enough to get the funding. So yeah, in this presentation, I'll go over some of those common downfalls and highlight some kind of top tips to avoid them in your application. Now, the next slide, please, Megan. Okay, so here I've pulled together the common downfalls into 4 categories, and they are that the proposal is too complex, the team doesn't have the expertise for the proposed project, poor value for money, and limited scope geographically. So as you can see, the unsuccessful applications from the first round fell into 2 or more of these categories, so it's really worth considering them when thinking about your proposal. And in the next slides, I'll kind of go into a bit more detail of each of these 4 and what we're looking for in a successful application. Next slide, please. Okay, so firstly, the proposal is too complex. So many proposals were unsuccessful because they focused on maybe too many species or too many different activities without a clear plan. And then this resulted in a confused and quite complex proposal, which is hard to evaluate and also can seem like it's not been thought through, even though it might have been, just the way the application comes across. So when an application is difficult for the panel to evaluate, it's more likely to score poorly. So kind of as clear as possible is great. And then some top tips to try and avoid this criticism is to really take time to assess the scope, scale, and complexity of your proposal. So maybe speaking to technical experts to ensure that ideas are realistic and have been well thought through, and just to try and make the panel confident that you'll be able to deliver what you're proposing. So for example, make sure that times and costs of given activities are realistic and that important aspects haven't been overlooked. And then secondly, often proposals would have scored better by taking a simpler approach with clarity on activities, aims, and specific outputs, ensuring that the scale and cost of the project is comparable with the outputs. So by this, I really don't want to discourage ambitious projects because that is what we're looking for. But also learning from last year, there were instances where the projects would have scored higher if they'd been a bit more pared back. For example, working with fewer species or fewer kind of activities, especially if applicants were new to seed sourcing, because it might seem like it's not a huge project, but when the evaluation panel looked at it, it would have been. Again, and then at the end, where projects are complex and cannot be simplified without losing merit, consider how best to present the ideas. So when the evaluation panel are going through the applications, it's amazing when it's kind of laid out really clearly. So maybe including timelines with separate activities and sites so that it's because you'll be very clear with what you're writing, but we might not be able to understand it quite as well. So we know it's like a really complex area, and it's difficult because we're also asking for a lot of detail. So it's we're kind of asking for the impossible, but putting some thought into how your ideas are presented is really, really helpful for us. And yeah, it gives a better chance of high scores. Next slide, please, Megan. Okay, so yeah, team doesn't have the expertise required. Many proposals were really well intentioned and the evaluation panel supported the vision, but the team just didn't quite show the expertise required for the project. So they might have never worked with the species before, or the way it was written, they didn't appear to fully understand the registration and FRM kind of system, or they were just entirely new to seed sourcing. And we do really encourage newcomers, but we need to know that it's been thought through. So some top tips to avoid this one is that we encourage people who are new to seed sourcing to seek help from expertise to advise on the project, even if it's on an ad hoc basis, or if you just mention them in your application that you've sought some help or like had a discussion about it. It helps to show us that the project's realistic and can be delivered. And then also for proposals to plan and plant a seed stand or orchard, it's especially important to consult with external experts if you haven't done something like that before, or even if you have, like, just to kind of get another opinion on things, and then describe this in as much detail as possible in the application. Just again to show us that you've really thought about it and that some of the details haven't been overlooked, because it's probably the most technical thing that's under like the eligible activities. Yeah, I think that's it for that one. Can I have the next slide, please, Megan? So the proposal doesn't present good value for money. We had a few instances where proposals scored poorly on value for money, and it's such a shame because they could be good and then the costs just aren't quite accurate or realistic in some cases. So some top tips to try and avoid this one is, at the end of the day, with a grant, we have to be confident that the proposal presents good value for money in terms of the outputs. So if you try and make sure that the scale and cost of your project is comparable to the outputs. So it's kind of unlikely that an expensive proposal that's only going to produce a small amount of seed of one species, or like just for personal use, is going to get funded. So you just need to, yeah, try and make sure they're comparable, because we're happy to fund projects with small outcomes, but as long as that is relative to the cost. And then on the top tips, we've got to be clear on the plan to bring the seed to market, including how you plan to bring it to market. And yeah, using estimates, which all comes into the outputs, because there are a few applications that were let down as the evaluation panel weren't convinced that there was a plan in place, or that anyone in the team was kind of familiar with marketing FRM or seed collections. And yeah, they just weren't confident on that value for money aspect. And then there's also, so this point's potentially a little bit niche, but it did come up a few times, where staff and contractors are included. Please try and include what their role will actually be and what kind of their duties are, because when it's quite a large chunk of the cost, we need to know like what that cost is going towards. Yeah, and then just the last point, check carefully that all costs included are eligible, because that can make a big difference to your finances spreadsheet if there's some there that they're not eligible costs. And just email the SSG email account if you are not sure about certain ones, because I'm sure people are happy to tell you if kind of they are eligible or what you need to include. Next one, please. Okay, this is the last section, and it's that the proposal is limited by its geographic area. So several proposals were unsuccessful as they were too limited in their geographic area, especially where the proposal involved surveying land. So a small bid might not need to cover a large area, and that's obviously fine, but it's difficult for a more expensive bid to present good value for money where the area is very limited. So to overcome this, we suggested thinking about reaching out to and joining up with other organisations to increase the area covered. So this could be maybe like a local authority in a nearby area or another landowner or organisation, anyone really who could offer a wider geographical range to the proposal. And yeah, this one's especially important where the proposal is for surveying the land for new seed stands, especially if it's more expensive, because it's just all, it needs to be comparable. We did have a few instances of that. And then I think I've got one more slide, Megan, on a few bits that just didn't fit into any of my previous slides, so they're just in a little extra bit. So yeah, firstly, if you can try and explicitly state your access to land, so whether it's ownership or an agreement with a landowner, because some proposals were held back as the panel weren't sure that they own the land. And although it might seem really obvious to you how you have this land, if the panel can't see it, then it reduces their confidence in the deliverability of the project. So yeah, it might just be one quick sentence of just how you have the land available. And then the second one, I did touch on it in the expertise slide, I think, but it's just a final plea to ask for as much detail as possible on design if your proposal includes like creating a new seed stand or orchard, because the more detail that the panel can see, it just allows them to accurately assess the deliverability in the time frame, as well as increasing their confidence in the quality of the proposed work and that the technical aspects have been thought about in enough detail. Okay, and then finally, just if possible, it's really helpful to supply any maps with grid references if you have them, as some of the panel members like to use aerial photography and mapping to understand like the context of the application more. So again, it just really provides them with more information and hopefully more confidence in the project. Oh yeah, I said this. Sorry, the bullet points the wrong way around. But yeah, that's the end of this, I think. And I hope it's been helpful. And we will share these slides because I've put a lot of detail in them. But when you're doing the application, it might just be worth checking over to make sure you don't fall into some of these downfalls. Back to you, Claire.
Thank you so much, Maddie and Megan. So you'll be pleased to know we've come to the end of us firing information at you, and we're going to open the floor to questions. So before I do that, I'd like to introduce the rest of the panel. So essentially, we're open to all kinds of questions now. They might be questions on the grant itself, and they may be questions for our experts. So I'd like, if you can put your screens on, please. I know it's terrifying being called an expert, but you are. So we have with us today kindly both Amanda and John, who are from the FRM team in FC. They both have a wealth of experience in the FRM guidelines and how they're applied. And this is the team that you'll be liaising with any projects which involve either registering or inspecting seed orchards and seed stands. Then we have Ted Chapman with us from Q. So Ted is the UK Conservation Partnerships Coordinator at the Millennium Seed Bank. Ted also has a wealth of expertise in seed collecting and seed conservation and use of collections. To draw to your particular attention, Ted oversees the team that manage the UK National Tree Seed Project. That particular project has collected tree seed from every seed zone in which native seed occur, and obviously the data and the collections from that project may well be of interest and helpful to some of your SSG ideas. So Ted is the person at Q to be talking with around those resources. And then finally, Richard Whittitt joining us from FR. So Richard is head of tree breeding and brings with him a lot of experience right across the SSG kind of gamut, but particularly the genetics side. So if you're looking for support or answers to questions around, how much genetic variability you should be bringing into a seed stand or a seed orchard, Richard can help answer those questions. So they're your expert panel. We've also got Megan, myself, Jack and Maddie. Could you put your cameras on as well, please? Who are your SSD team. So we, between us, can also answer questions on applying, what the grant is all around in general, basically any other things you might want to throw at us, hopefully. So with that, I will open the floor. As I say, you may put your questions in the chat or just put your hand up. Just trying to.
I see there's a question in the chat already regarding seed. So, do trees used for seed collection need to be tested before seeds are collected? And do the trees we grow for this project need to be tested, bought from a known source? And can the testing be claimed for? So I can answer part of that. So what we ask is, so the trees themselves don't need to be tested before seed is collected, but when seed is collected, if that seed is going to be marketed to go into forestry projects, then it needs to be tested before it can be marketed, basically. So in order for us to issue a certificate, then we would need that seed to be tested. Do the trees we grow from this project need to be tested, bought from a known source? So if something's going to end up in a forestry, if it's being marketed for forestry purposes, then the trees do need to be not bought from a known source. So the trees need to be certified. The material needs to be certified. And I don't know about the testing, can it be claimed for?
My understanding, and I'll let Megan correct me if I'm wrong, is, as you said, Amanda, the testing is at the point that the seeds are collected and marketed, so that wouldn't be eligible. It's not part, because the seed sourcing grant is around the seed sources themselves. It's not, activity collecting from those is not within SSG.
Yeah, I'd agree with that, Claire.
Okay. We got any other questions? And thank you, Phil. So I think this is probably one for Megan regarding the £75,000 cap per year per applicant. Does this include the grant awarded under round one?
No. So yeah, just to make it clear, anyone who applied in round one, whether they were successful or unsuccessful, can apply again this year, and we won't be taking into account the value of your project for round one, so you'll be kind of starting at zero again. So yeah, you're welcome to apply again.
Again, just giving people space to type if they're still thinking of questions. Feel free to just put your hand up as well if you prefer. No. Oh, Maddie. Coming in with your own question.
Ted, I just wondered whether you could kind of outline how people can make use of the Millennium Seed Bank for their applications and how they might need to contact you before as they're writing their application.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Maddie. Hi, everybody. So Claire introduced the fact that at the Millennium Seed Bank, we hold quite comprehensive collections of the UK's native woody flora. So the seed from those collections is available for research or conservation use. So that is one consideration when thinking about new seed orchards. But perhaps almost of more relevance is the data that we hold on the seed collections. So our seed collections come from locally autochthonous, locally native stands, which we've assessed for management history, population size, etc. So when thinking about the identification of potential new seed stands or registered seed stands, our data can be quite relevant and helpful. And in the first round of the SSG, it has proved to be really quite useful, and it can save potentially quite a bit of work. So if you feel that the data or potentially our seed collections might be of relevance to the project you're planning, I just urge you to get in touch kind of whilst you're developing your thinking and putting your proposal together, so that we can consider any costs that might be involved and write them into your applications and kind of get everything organised up front. It's much easier for us to respond in that way than kind of later down the line. Also, in the application guidance, there are the kind of links and prompts to connect you to resources that we have around assessing populations and seed collecting and handling techniques. So again, hopefully that kind of technical information is useful, but if you have any questions about making seed collections from wild populations, that's something that we can potentially help with. So I think my contact details are in the guidance documentation. So have a think if we can help, and if so, get in touch with us as early as possible. That probably covers it. Thanks, Maddie.
Brilliant question. Thank you. Thanks, Maddie, for bringing that up. Okay, we've got a couple more in the chat now. So Rachel Richards is asking, can land be claimed for? And also, if we have grown trees supplied by the Woodland Trust, can we use these as a seed stand? So I'll pass the first one to Megan, and then I think a few of us will probably chip in on the second part of that. So Megan, land.
So yeah, you wouldn't be able to claim for land, but I think some of the first round applicants, if they weren't growing it on their land, they'd perhaps partnered with another organisation where they were planting a stand or orchard on their land. So if you don't have land available, that could be a route that you could go down, perhaps.
Yeah. Maddie, can I just check? Is your hand still your old hand? Can I?
Sorry, yeah, it is.
That's all right. So Rachel, I might need you to come on and speak actually and explain your question a little bit more about if you're saying if we have grown trees supplied by Woodland Trust, can we use these as a seed source? I'm struggling to understand exactly what activity that might fall under, whether you're talking about planting a seed stand and sort of retrospectively claiming that, because if you've already planted it, it's kind of already there. I think the source of the trees may not be relevant in terms of who gave you the trees, but it's around knowing their genetic origin. So are you able to speak a little bit more and give us slightly more detail?
Yeah, I'm just thinking about where to source trees to create a seed stand. So if they're provided by the Woodland Trust or Woodland Trust suppliers, which are they've gone through Plant Healthy or UCSIG, would they be suitable sources for a seed stand?
Right. Okay. So
because they would have they will have gone through some certification before we bought them.
Yeah. So that's a really great point. The fact that they are UK sourced and grown, and the fact that they're plant healthy obviously means they're fantastic planting stock in that they are likely to be biosecure. You're not going to be introducing pests and diseases. If they're UK and Ireland sourced and grown, we know their UK origin. I think depending on exactly what you were aiming to do, we would potentially prefer it if we knew the exact genetic origin of the material.
Okay.
Sorry. I was going to just bring in a couple of, I think Richard and John might also want to comment on that. Sorry, Rachel, did you want to ask the second part of your question? You're about to come back.
Yeah, just to clarify, so if we've already got trees that we've planted by the Woodland Trust, which we normally use for seed collection, but we do have, say, for example, no protection for those trees, and we wanted to make sure that they were, we could open it up to other people as a seed stand. Would we be able to claim for fencing, for example, or, you know, access tracks or that sort of thing to enable us to use trees that already exist on the land that are also from a known supplier?
Yes, so that would fall under activity 1, sort of bringing an existing stand onto the register and into management. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. That's
And you can claim for those costs like fencing and access. That's exactly what that's for.
Thank you.
Does that fully answer your question, or did?
Yes, it does. Thank you. Yeah.
All right, I think you're off the hook then, Richard and John. And then Phil Laking, can we have both an SSG and a UCO grant for the same area of land? I'm gonna ask Megan, but I think you can have it on the same area of land so long as there's no duplication in what you're claiming for. So I don't think you could claim for planting trees under UCO and then claim for planting exactly the same trees under SSG. But Megan, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, I think it would be about the individual activities rather than the area of land. So yeah, any activity that's funded by UCO, we wouldn't be able to fund under SSG. But if they were completely separate activities, then I think that would be fine. But Jack, correct me if you think that's wrong.
Yeah, I've been thinking in the background, that's the position I would take on that. Basically, they'd have to be distinct activities being funded by each grant.
Cool, thank you. Okay, so we haven't got any more questions coming in at the moment. Did any of the panel, if I start with John and Amanda, did you have anything in particular that Maddie hasn't already mentioned from the first round that you would highlight to applicants this round?
Not specifically, but what I would reiterate is the fact that if anyone is at all unsure about any of the FRM terminology, would like to know more about the different categories of material, that just to contact us directly, and we can have a chat. We can go through it because it will give that a little bit more support, and we're happy to answer any questions and provide any support.
Thanks, Amanda. Richard, I suspect we might be wrapping up. Was there anything that you wanted to contribute before we do so?
Not particularly. I guess what would look upon favourably is evidence that you've thought about the longer term traceability of the materials. So maybe even thinking about collecting samples for genetic markers and things like that would all be looked upon favourably.
Thanks, Richard. Okay, just going to give you 30 seconds more in case anyone suddenly. Yeah, Rachel, if a stand is registered, does that mean anyone can come to collect from that area? That's entirely up to the landowner. So this is part of what Maddie was getting at in some of her tips. So the registered owner of the land on which a seed stand occurs can decide whether they open up that seed stand for use by others, and others might be commercial or non-commercial seed collectors, or whether they use it for their own exclusive use. And we would want that explained in the question that Megan was highlighting around how you're going to bring the seed to market. Obviously, because we're using public funding, we're seeking to get the maximum impact possible for the funding that we're providing. So it may be that if you could make a good case why it should be for your own exclusive access, that we we would fund, but we would be much more likely to fund if you've got a clear rationale for a large number of seed collectors being able to access the site. Okay. Right. Okay.
Claire,
Well,
I was just going to say, is it worth just highlighting Paul's comment for anyone who hasn't seen the chat? So Paul's just
yeah.
commented in the chat that he's happy to collaborate if applicants are looking for land. So that's at East Durham College. So just in case anyone hadn't seen that one.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Thanks, Phil. And, you know, in general, you know, collaborative proposals do tend to be stronger because it obviously gives us confidence that, you know, this isn't just one person's sort of idea. There's a whole team going to make it happen. Okay. Well, hopefully that's been useful for everyone. Please do make use of the entire panel. As we've said, we're all available and we would all much prefer to have chats up front now than either see proposals that aren't quite there or frustratingly that we're not able to fund. So please do make use of us over the next few weeks. But with that, I'll close the meeting and thank you all for your time.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Thanks all.
Thanks all. Bye for now.
Thank you.
Thank you.